Welcome to Restore the Glory podcast. My name is Jake Kim.
And I'm Bob Schutz.
We're two Catholic therapists sharing what we've learned personally and professionally to help you on the journey of restoration. If you've been blessed by our podcast, please prayerfully consider partnering with us on Patreon. Your support will help cover the cost to produce the podcast, but will also give you access to exclusive content like monthly reflections and special live stream teachings. Go to patreon.com/restorethe-glory and join the mission of experiencing the restoration of our God-given glory. Hey, Bob. Good to be back with you again. We are continuing on in our series here on healing and leadership. And I'm having a very unique moment because I'm looking on the screen at two people who I'm regularly on screens with. So our guest today is a very, very dear friend of mine whom I host another podcast with, Brett Powell. And it's really funny for me because I'm looking at both you and I'm like, which thing am I? What do I, the way of the glory and the heart of the pod. And so for those of you who don't know, Bob and I obviously have a podcast, Restore Glory. That's where we're here. But I also have another podcast that I do with Brett, particularly for men on the masculine journey. And it's called The Way of the Heart. And so if you haven't heard of that, you can go check that out. But this is really fun for me because my two worlds are colliding. But one of the reasons, Brett, that we invited you on is because you're an expert in leadership. And I know that you wouldn't self-reference yourself that way because that's not the kind of guy you are, but that's the reality of the situation is that you find yourself in all kinds of leadership settings and scenarios. And knowing you very, very well and knowing your story, you've worked in lay ministry and apostolate movements, Catholic Christian outreach. You've worked in the institutional church and being an archbishop's delegate. That's where you currently work for the Archdiocese of Vancouver. And you also work kind of like, I don't know, freelance. I don't know what the word would be, but you have your own kind of ministry where leadership where it matters most. And people can find that brettpowell.org and find all the information there. But I've been, Brett, just so impressed with, because I've gotten to see Brett firsthand what you go through like that a lot of people don't get to see, right? I have gotten the behind the scenes picture and how much you lead with the character of Christ. And it's just such a blessing because I get to receive it as a layman in the diocese. And so I'm just really excited to have you on because I know these worlds that Bob and I are talking about are very much your world as well. And so it's just really exciting to have you on and to have this conversation. So welcome to Restore the Glory.
Oh, man. Thank you very much, Jake, Dr. Bob. This is a real treat. I mean, I'm a listener to the podcast. I benefit from it so much. It's just, it's a real honor to be here for sure. And I would not consider myself an expert. I am a student of leadership and always will be. Yeah, for sure.
You know way more about it than I do.
I've had to learn some things. Well, can I tell you the story how I really got into it?
Please.
So this would have been many, many years ago, but I was actually on a plane from Toronto to Vancouver. And I was just feeling pressed in every way a man can feel pressed. I was under financial strain at the time. I was under, a growing family. My wife and I have 8 kids. I think we had 5 children at the time, 8 and under. I mean, we were in the thick of family life and diapers and all that. And I was happened to be growing in kind of, responsibility with CCO at the time, Catholic Christian Outreach. And I was just feeling so pressed. And so what happened was on this plane, I cracked open a book that I'd been given probably 2 years before, but never found the time to really enter into it. And it's a book probably many of your listeners are familiar with, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Stephen Covey. And the wisdom met my need as a gift from God. It really did. I gleaned so much in the acute experience that I had as a leader in family and the ministry and all that. And I assimilated some of these things in my life. And some of the principles I learned literally on that flight still guide every day of my life to this day. So when I say I'm a student of leadership, I'm a desperate student of leadership because I need it. You know what I mean? And I think a lot of people listening could understand that poverty of time, energy, capacity that we as leaders often face. So that's really how it started. It was really out of desperation. Yeah.
Wow.
And it hasn't stopped.
Yeah, that's a great way to approach that, and keeping your heart open in that way, and knowing it's always a process. We've met once, and I really enjoyed that. We were up in the Washington State area, and you came down, and I really enjoyed meeting you and your wife. And I know that I've listened to some of your podcasts with Jake, but this is a gift for me too, to be able to have this time with you. My daughter and son-in-law have 8 children too, so I kind of know and understand that world a little bit by living right on the edge of it every day.
That's
the blessing, Dr. Bob, as Grandpa, you get to walk away and go to sleep.
Yeah, it is. I get to sleep at nights. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah. Brett, it's kind of a little bit off script, but I thought it could be a valuable just place to start. It's like a thing. And I'm curious, like Bob, I'm just noticing we've never really done this with any of our, like anybody else with this, but Brett, how would you define leadership? What is leadership to you? And because I know that it's not just I go to work.
Yeah. So
what is leadership? And then we'll get into leadership and healing.
Absolutely. I guess 2 things, well, maybe 3 come to mind for sure. I think the best definition of leadership is also the shortest, and it comes from John Maxwell, who's a former evangelical pastor turned leadership guru. And I think, Dr. Bob, you've even hinted at this too. But leadership really means influence. And it's about influencing people in a positive direction for their benefit and the benefit of the world. That's really what leadership is. That involves inspiration, that involves enabling people to act, empowering them, blessing them, like all kinds of things. But really, it is the essence of it is influence. And the reason why I'd start with that is because what leadership is not is a position or a title. I mean, that buys you time, but that's it. Like, it really comes down to being able, by God's grace, to influence in a positive direction. So that'd be the first thing. The second thing is leadership is self-gift. And for this, it's totally fixed eyes on Jesus, that he is the greatest leader that ever lived, the greatest influence on the world. I mean, the very year in which we live is in reference to him. And he was self-gift. The greatest act of leadership ever done in human condition is his act on the cross of absolutely self-gift and emptying himself for the benefit of other people. I can't think of a better icon of what leadership really is, all about. I guess a third thing, and we could probably get into this later, but I think as a father in particular, I think leadership is really manifesting the presence of the Father in the world. Obviously by his grace, and this is not, getting confused with who God is and who I am not, but it really is about bringing the Father's presence into the world. Jesus was the express image of the Father. We are called to image the Father and bring his life in the world. One of the things that, leadership is way beyond organizational or ministry, right? My primary domain of leadership is as a father. And one of the mantras that I have, and Jake, you've probably heard this before, but is to really, by God's grace, paint an accurate image of God the Father by the brush of my example. I can't think of a higher calling in life than that. And a source of pain and struggle and, all of it, right? But the ideal, the aspirational ideal, is to be the presence of the Father in the world.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. No small task on any of that. But I love it. I think of the scripture, and we've referenced it before, the scripture of when James and John are vying for position in the kingdom, and Jesus said, anybody who wants to be great needs to be the servant of the rest. And that's what I hear in that definition. And then I think of John Paul II's, I think it was in a book on hope, and he said, the key to understanding all reality is the attempt of the evil one to destroy fatherhood, which is to destroy the image of the Father in our lives. And so Jesus came to restore it. And each one of us, as you're saying, as men and women, are called to restore that image. And that's great definition of leadership, is revealing his image.
That's a great quote. Yeah.
Like, Brett, I mean, it's as I'm sitting with it, right? The domains are getting juggled. And I think for a lot of people, that's just an interesting thing right off the bat, because when we start to step into healing, Bob, like I'm going, this is father wounds. This is like, I mean, it just, the categories just start exploding when you think about leadership. And so, just a plug for both of the podcasts. Like, Brett, you and I talk a lot about these things on our podcast, and Bob, you and I have talked about these things on our podcast. And so there's just that category just opens it up in a whole other way. But maybe we'll step into that a little bit. Like, I don't know if that, I mean, so we have our 4 questions that we're asking everybody in this series. But so number 1, how has brokenness affected your leadership? And I'm thinking, Brett, because you laid out the categories nicely, automatically we go to work, right? But I'm hearing you go, no, it's husband, father, friend, coach, teacher. I mean, there's all these other categories that often go outside of where you get your paycheck. So for you, how has brokenness affected you as a father, husband, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah. And that's exactly it. Because the brokenness you have as an individual affects every way you manifest leadership, and I think, it's tempting for, and I would say particularly men, but maybe I'm not accurate in saying that, but I think it's particularly tempting for men to get things right at work, because at work, often leaders have something they can lean on, which is a title or a position to get people to do what you want them to do or what the right thing is and this kind of thing, right? I believe parenting, fatherhood, motherhood is the most intensive leadership endeavor in the world and always will be, because all you have is yourself. Like, you are who you are in the 4 walls of your home, and how you interact and relate. Like, in a certain sense, you have some title pressure, if you will, with your kids when they're young. When they're 18, you've got nothing but what you've sown in the emotional bank account with those kids. Like, nothing else, right? So it is the most leadership intensive endeavor in the world. And it's easy to rely on, propped up kings and queens with titles and positions to get people to do what you want and have this sense of influence and all the rest of it. But it's smoke and mirrors compared to the intensity of home life. So yeah, at all the brokenness I've experienced and the healing, it affects everything. Like, I mean, one of the values that I have is the integrated life. Jake, you've heard me talk about this in the past, but and I clarified that value. This is like 20 years ago, and I'm still reading these things in my own, writings and stuff as though I wrote them yesterday. Like, these things will never change. They're the most important things in my life. And this value of integrated living, essentially how I summarize it is that, leaders are basically, ordinary people accomplishing extraordinary things, and extraordinary people living very ordinary lives. And that's the blend. And I never want to be in a situation, and I pray for leaders to never be in a situation where there's such an incongruence between professional leadership and home, because that is a painful reality. You live one life, and who you are is what you bring into it. So where I'm broken, the tendencies to have a negative impact at home are the same at work. Like, one of the things that I struggle with in my brokenness because of performance orientation, just to get real personal real quick, is that I know that my kids can actually experience from me something that I never want them to experience. But essentially, it's conditional love. It's that when they, make the right decisions, do the right things, blah, 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 the list goes on and on, then dad will love them. Now, you and I know that it's not about love, but it's about my expression of it. It's about their interaction with me. So that's brokenness, and people feel that. I have a performance orientation, and I know people in my work, sometimes it's difficult just to mirror this sounds bad, but my capacity or my drive. And it may not be coming from a good place. My drive might be performance orientation, and people are trying to keep up, and they get exhausted. They get tired. So yeah, I mean, who I am and the brokenness and the healing that I've experienced, it touches on all aspects of my life, because if you're a leader, you're leading in everything. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Can you draw out a little bit that performance orientation? And as I'm hearing you describe it, it's your own personal drive to excel, right? And then the way that people look at you and relate to you, and particularly with your children, the way that you look at them, depending on their performance. What in that is brokenness? Like, describe the brokenness, because some people might be listening and saying, "Well, that's a good thing, That's like, aren't we all supposed to achieve?" And
that exactly, Dr. Bob, because there is some goodness to it. Like, I'm weeds and wheat, just like everybody else. There's good things and there's bad things, and they all manifest. When I talk about performance orientation, I think it was John Paul II in 2002, and I think you've quoted this in the past, but I've got this one written down. It means a lot to me. But when he spoke these words, you are not the sum of your weaknesses and failures. You are the sum of the Father's love for you, and the real capacity to image Jesus in the world, or something like that.
Yeah.
So I actually wrote this down. This is what my performance orientation would hear in a unhealed state. This is what that quote sounds like. You are the sum of your strengths and weaknesses. You are the sum of your successes and failures. So you better get it right. And the Father's love for you fluctuates based on how well you perform in all aspects of life. You have capacity to manifest Jesus in the world, but you're on your own to do it. Don't mess it up.
Wow. Yeah.
Right. That's the depth of what can operate, right? And I mean, I have been, through various stages of healing and various streams of healing that have come into my life, from just good, healthy fellowship and relationships to profound encounters with God's grace that you can't refabricate if you tried to, counseling, to Elijah House ministry, to, all these different forms. But I still struggle with it. I can still default. I don't know about you, but it's like my journey is like, it's like a car that is always getting dirty. It's like I've got to go back in and get, cleaned up and healed, and it's got to go deeper and all that. And sometimes, when your car is really dirty, people walk up and they actually write on it, "Wash me," whatever. Yeah. That's when you really know your healing is impacting other people, right? When they come against it, it's like, oh my gosh, that's me. Yeah. But it's just a spiral, right? It's a lifetime of healing, preparation for the beatific vision, to sound theological. I mean, that really is what it is. I'm in it for the long haul. God's got a lot of work in my heart. Yeah.
Yeah. And in that sense, it's a gift then when your kids come and you can see how you've hurt them, because they're the ones that you have that most intimate relationship, and it becomes part of the wash me on the windshield, right?
Oh, well, it's funny, Dr. Bob, because I think one of the best things that we can do to really manifest leadership is to apologize when you screw up. And man, it can be humbling to apologize to a 2-year-old.
Yeah.
Or a 16-year-old, right? And yet it's so important to do, because, and I would say that at work, I think even at work, it could be harder for some people, because you think if you apologize, you're admitting that you're less than you should be. And it's like, whether you apologize or not, everybody knows you messed up. Like, you're doing yourself a favor. You're reestablishing the relationship at the influence when you recognize that. So, that's a very important, I think, leadership principle that we need to get straight, that we really do need to apologize when we mess up. And that sounds like such a very basic thing to say, but it's just so important.
And those are gifts that my dad gave me that, with all of his faults, I can remember as a child when he would react impatiently and get angry, he'd come in and sit down on the bed and say, "I'm sorry for hurting you." And just, that meant everything. I never hardened my heart towards him.
Yeah.
And then after he left the family and, just really destroyed a lot of things, the moment that he sat and first addressed all of us and asked for forgiveness, but sat with us and the entire 3 generations of the family, and looked at my mom and looked at all of us and said, "I'm sorry, it's my fault." I just had such admiration for his humility and courage, and understanding God's mercy. So yeah, it just really speaks to me a lot.
And I know your story, Dr. Bob, and I hear it on the podcast and all that. And it's just such a beautiful example, because what humility that would have taken, and it's such evidence, even in the midst of all the turmoil and the chaos that was caused, it's such evidence of grace in his life.
Yeah.
To humble himself, look in the eye, own it, and then allow the opportunity to give forgiveness. What a gift, right?
Really
what an
is.
incredible gift. So,
Brett, I know your story quite well, and I'm curious if you'd be willing to share the Whiz Kid story, because it's such a great example, I think, for people to be able to go, here's how that story manifests itself in performance orientation, and it connects the dot, I think, for people. Would you be willing to share that?
Yeah, sure. So, there's this photograph that exists, and it's a picture of me when I was probably 13 or 14 years old. And I'm standing in front of my parents' dining room, and I've got a trophy in this arm and a trophy in this arm. And then behind me, my mom has created these levels of all the different awards that I received that year. And I'm wearing this t-shirt that says Whiz Kid. And I look at this photo, and probably a lot of people would look at that and go, that's amazing, and your parents must be so proud. I loathe the photo because it represents so much of the burden of performing. I know both of you have athletic background. It is such an opportunity to develop this performance orientation. You do something well, people applaud. You don't, it's silent, right? And that, stayed with me for, that was definitely one of those incidents that needed healing. I can speak about it differently now, but even as I do, I see the image, it stirs within me, because in a certain sense, I'm not just mourning what I experienced, but I'm mourning the loss of what I didn't experience, which was a certain freedom, a certain freedom to fail, a certain freedom to not, whatever, get an accolade or whatever, like to just be. So, and this is why I fast forward, and I was in a Blessings Christian bookstore. Jake, remember when those were around in the Lower Mainland? And I picked up that book by Gord MacDonald. It was called Ordering Your Private World. And I opened the front flap of the cover, and it just had this big, bold question. It said, "Are you driven or called?" And I was in this bookstore having a moment with God, because it was like he elevated this question to penetrate my heart. It's like, why are you so anxious? Like, and not in an accusatory way, but it was just elevating what was beneath the thin veneer of my heart. It was just, it arrested me. It was another moment of encountering that and my need for healing. So there's a lot of layers to performance orientation. I'll give you another one. You're going to think this is weird, but it's my story. It's been redeemed. Praise God. One of the first verses that I memorized in the scripture has always been very, very important part of how God has invaded my life in positive ways. But one of the first scriptures that I memorized was Revelations 3:17. Now, you'd think Revelation 3:20 is, behold, I stand at the door and knock. Anyone who opens the door, I will come in and dine with him and he with me. No, Revelation 3:17 says, you say that you are rich and have need of nothing, and you do not know that you are wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked. Ooh. And I think, why am I memorizing that? It's communicating. It's almost like an identity. I see it in the scripture. This is what shame does in my heart. These are feelings that I have. It's another revelation of where I was, the state I was in, if you will, when I first encountered the Lord. So that's how strong performance orientation can be. It can become really this identity, which goes back to the fluctuation of the Father's love and the distortion of John Paul II's beautiful, beautiful words there.
Yeah, as
That's
you say,
odd, right? To memorize that first?
No, that passage was instrumental in my own deepening conversion, so I get it.
Wow.
That as you're talking about these two ideas, performance orientation and fatherhood, right? And so many of us had fathers who were performance oriented and drove us in that direction because it's part of what we think is masculinity in our culture. And maybe every human being has that element. But I think of Father Jacques Philippe talking about fatherhood. And, without fatherhood, there's no room for failure. And he's talking about the prodigal son story and how, what if the father wasn't present when the younger son came back? Or what if the father acted like the older brother when the younger son came back? You screwed up. You don't deserve anything. That's how we treat ourselves. But he's illustrating, it's the father who allows us to fail.
Yeah.
And that's true leadership. Not only saying I'm sorry, but giving permission for failure and recognizing that failure is part of that growth.
Yeah.
Guys, how did that get so jacked up? Because that, like just what we're talking about, the freedom to fail, I don't know about you, but it feels so, there's something in me that goes, what in the world are we talking about right now? But I know the truth. And maybe I'm trying to find the sweet spot, but I know I'm very performance oriented and have to be very careful with that. Bob, I know that you can struggle with that too. Just it's all of our backgrounds. And again, we're kind of, is this humanity wide? And maybe we're not just unique three chaps here, but
I'm guessing probably not.
Probably not. Yeah.
Yeah.
But isn't it odd that, like, I'm thinking about coaching my son's basketball team. That is a place where it is really hard to navigate and manage performance orientation. As I'm trying to help these young men become good men, it's infused into that. And I guess that's what I'm struggling with is this whole dynamic. When we think about leadership, it's so much about performance. And then that understandably translates over to God. And I feel like we're just hovering around a giant dynamic that maybe a lot of people don't even realize is present in their lives, especially as they lead. That failure, I'm like, there's no room, right? There's no room for failure. So Bob, for you to bring that in, it sounds like you're on a different planet. That freedom to fail is what is allowed with fatherhood. Like, I'm just curious for both of you. Like, what strikes you as you hear that, and why are we here? What do we do about it, especially for leaders? Like, Brett, we'll start with you.
Yeah. Well, and this goes, I was thinking about one of the questions that you said asked was around the role of healing in leadership. So when Dr. Bob brings up the fatherhood, and I mentioned fatherhood is, the one of the primary icons of the way that we actually bring leadership into the world. And the reason for that is because it cuts to the greatest need in the human heart, which is the restoration of trust in the Father as creator. I mean, Jake, how many times have you and I quoted the Catechism? Adam and Eve, having lost trust in their creator, allowed trust in their creator to die in their heart. And to think about that. In other words, they lost a sense of his goodness, of his self-gifting love. And when you don't have that, you hide your shame, your mistakes, everything. So fatherhood is not just sloppy agape. It's not throwing around those things, but it's the freedom to fail in your presence, make mistakes, commit sin, knowing that you're coming back. I mean, when you mentioned the story of the prodigal son, I mean, how many times have we read that? I was just giving a retreat to some Catholic school teachers, and I used the prodigal son, and I went through the same ring, robe, and sandals, and I'm weeping as I'm talking about it because it's such a universal restoration that we need to know and experience that we are the honored guests, that we're part of the family, and that we have sandals of freedom to always leave. This is what unconditional love actually is. So leadership actually has the opportunity to manifest fatherhood And that's the greatest human need in our heart, is to have that trust restored. And this is why, sorry, I'm going on a bit of a rant, but this is
That's
what
good.
I think all of us as leaders, whether it's in the home or in your organizations or in your ministry or whatever, have to realize is that the very assault on the heart of Adam and Eve so that they would be convinced that the Father was holding something back is the same assault that's happening in our kids' heart against us and in our staff's heart against us. He is trying to convince them that we are holding something back, and we are fallen creatures. Like we do hold things back, right?
Right.
But
right.
this is the call. This is why it's the greatest manifestation of leadership, and the need of every human heart is to just manifest that place of safety, that place of forgiveness and healing and presence. I think the most important part of leadership is the presence you bring in the room. It has nothing to do with what you contribute. It has nothing to do with your strategy, your 20-year plan, your big, hairy, audacious goal, your strategic anchors, your blah, 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 blah. All those things are necessary. But if your presence isn't right, nothing is right. Now, we're fallen creatures, and I don't want to, fall into performance orientation for that, but that's the aspirational goal, right? Is to manifest the Father. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Bob,
Yeah. Well, just so much of what you're saying resonates with me. As you're talking about the child in that situation and safety, a sense of safety and trust, and in that security. I know you guys did a series on security, maturity, and purity, and that security is based on love that doesn't measure our performance, right? It's based on love that sees our inherent goodness and just loves us because we're belong to them, right? And that's good fatherhood. I love you when you succeed and when you fail. Doesn't mean I'm going to encourage you to fail. I want you to succeed, but I want you to recognize that succeeding doesn't get you my approval and love. You have my approval. You are my beloved in whom I delight. And that's the basis of security, And so I think of St. Paul talking about that. It's like before the Spirit comes, we live in this striving performance, and the whole world is in this striving performance to be good enough to be accepted. And then the Spirit comes and says, Abba, Father, that I have a relationship now. And so I think it's not so much that we celebrate failure, because obviously failure is the lack of something good, but we celebrate a person. And again, I'm not getting into, participation trophies. That's not the point. The point is I can celebrate you whether you've got 2 trophies in your arms or whether you're in a moment of desolation in your heart and you've done something wrong and you feel ashamed of yourself. I can love you there even more. And that's how God loves us. In the places of our vulnerability and our weaknesses, it's like God's love is more, not less.
Yeah.
So I found the quote, and I just want to read it for our listeners, Bob, the one that you were referencing about Father Jacques Philippe, because we'll put a link to it in the show notes from this article. But this is at one point, he says, without the presence of the merciful Father, we are delivered up to our faults without any possible remedy. There would be no forgiveness of error or sin, no place for weakness, frailty, or failure, all of which are nonetheless a part of our lives. We would be, in a way, condemned to succeed at life, something that really would be terrible. It would mean putting a terrible weight on our shoulders, an obligation to be superhuman, going like WizKid. I'm like, you could put WizKid right there. An obligation to be superhuman, going from success to success without any possibility of failure. What is that? Without a merciful Father, here's the consequence, right? I'm like, oh my gosh. So I have to share a little story, and I'm realizing now maybe why. So Bob, you and I were in a meeting earlier today, and we were talking about this guy. His name's Jason Wilson. Now, I don't know anything about this guy, but he's apparently a former Navy SEAL who does a lot of like training and stuff for young people. And so he has this, I just watched a video of his, and it's exactly like what we're talking about right now. So I think it's worth sharing the story, and you can watch the clip on YouTube. I was totally crying watching it earlier today. So he's in like a dojo, some kind of karate dojo, and this kid is trying to punch through the wooden board. And he does the easy board first, and he's totally fathering him, the man, Jason Wilson, and he punches through that one. Then it comes time for the board, the real wooden board. And he punches it once, and he can't do it. And there's a video, and there's kids watching. And so he punches through, and he can't do it. I think he punches it again, or no, he starts shaking his hand. And then the leader guy says, "Does your hand hurt?" And he says something, I think the boy says something like, "No, sir." And then he stops him and says, "Remember, no pride here." And I just was like, whoa. So he paused, and then he starts to say, "No pride. It's okay to say if your hand hurts." And so he starts to share about his hand hurting. And then the whole thing spins because the guy starts talking about the performance that he has put on his karate kids and wanting to release them of that. And then the stinking kid is his actual son.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
And on the video, his son starts crying as he asks for forgiveness from his son in front of everybody for putting a spirit of performance on him.
Wow.
And his son is like maybe 8. And I'm like, an 8-year-old young boy knows exactly that dynamic in his heart, and he's weeping, and the man just pulls him in and hugs him and says, "I don't care if you can break a board. I love you, son. I don't care." And I'm like, that's it. This is exactly what we're talking about. Like, it's really powerful. So I would encourage you to go watch that on YouTube. Again, we'll put a link to that.
You have to put that in the notes.
Yeah. Well,
and one thing I want to say, because I think it's really important, it's not about mimicking these behaviors that we're speaking about, because behavior is never, it's a matter of your heart.
Yeah.
Right. And if your heart wants the good for everyone, your children, those that you work with, et cetera, that's going to come through, right? Because behavior wise, sometimes it's going to manifest. I mean, sometimes you have to hold people accountable. That's leadership. But when you're holding them accountable, if they walk away from a conversation, and let's say it's a reprimanding conversation, and they still know in your eyes they have dignity, worth, potential, and that you believe in their future, that is real leadership. So it's not like you dismiss these things, right? But the way in which you handle it is just different because of your heart, where your heart is at. You want what's best for them, and you're not going to hold back anything.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. And bringing that back to healing is your heart can't get there until you've gone to those places yourself, right?
Yeah.
Because even if you desire that and there's a place in your heart that's still living in that self-perfectionism, that's going to bleed out, right?
Yeah.
And again, not all or nothing, but it's why the transformation of the heart is so important.
Yeah. I mean, there's been many conversations where, let's say you've got a staff member and you have to hold them account because something wasn't done or something happened that maybe shouldn't have. And you have the conversation, you look them in the eye, this can't happen again. This is why. Now let's just pause and say, I don't think this is you. I don't think this is who you are as a person. I just want to create space. Is there anything going on that I can help you with? Right. So it's like, accountable, environment of flourishing. Let's talk about it. I'm your ally. We're on the same side of the table. What's this issue that I can help navigate with you? So that's why it's a matter of heart. It's not just mimicking these behaviors, but if your heart wants what is right and good, beautiful, hopeful in the future for these people, that's just going to leak out. It has to, right? Yeah. Anyways, maybe I'm babbling on that point now.
No, that's really good. And the opposite of that is shaming somebody in that situation.
Yeah.
Right? Or what would be some of the behaviors that are the brokenness in that same situation?
Yeah. You can shame them. You can focus only on the performance and not the future, not the hope. You cannot demonstrate support for it, which tells them you get this right. And if you don't, you've got no support mechanisms. I mean, I can give you a long list of things. It's right in my journal over the years. But it's all those things. But the shame aspect, that can happen so easy, right?
I think I've shared with both of you before this experience that I had with God, and it took a long time for me to be able, I think, to receive or know what to do with it. But I can't remember what the dynamic was about, and I think that's really important. I don't know where I messed up. I don't know what I did, but I'm in prayer and I'm repenting. And again, I don't know the details, but here's what I took away, which says a lot about the processing, how the human person processes a correction. I remember God corrected me very clearly. Actually, it's all coming back to me. So here's the story. Like, it's just so you could just see the dynamics of the heart here. So when we're talking about leadership and correction, et cetera. So I'm in prayer, I'm at the church, and I'm struggling for a time about not hearing God. And so the idea comes into my head, man, I think I might be like pretty advanced in the spiritual life. Like this sounds like pretty advanced because of look at all these problems I'm having. I should probably just double check that. I should probably double check that, maybe I'm in the fourth mansion or whatever. And I'm looking at it for a badge. Like I want to get my Cub Scout badge of holiness. And so I go to read this section of one book that talked about the various stages. And I said, well, maybe I'll just start at the beginning. And I read all the descriptors of like the beginning of the beginning. And I was like, oh, that's actually where I am. Like, I'm not even in the door of the first thing yet. And I just started laughing. And I felt like the Father was laughing with me, but it was also very corrective. And I walked away smiling and at the same time knowing I'm loved and going, my goodness. That was quite a thing, eh? And the Father's like, yeah, that was quite a, it's good to have you in the foyer of the whole deal. And I love that you're here, but yeah, we got a long way to go. But when you experience the opposite of that, of shame, and then all of a sudden you approach your relationship with God, with your earthly father, with leaders, the performance orientation, right? Like Father Jacques Philippe was saying, it's the burden of that is incredible, is absolutely incredible, right? And just look at the contrast of Matthew 11 and the weight of performance orientation. Like Jesus says, come to me, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, which is easy and light, versus take making me happy on you, which is heavy and heavy, or do it all right all the time so you think I'll be pleased with you. That's impossible and it crushes you. Like the difference there is huge. And the nuance I think that we're making, which for both of you guys, I think we could go into that zone of being the recipient of the yoke. But really what we're nuancing here is the giving of the yoke that comes in leadership. Right? We place yokes on people in leadership. And often it happens very subtly with what we do, what we don't do, what we praise, what we don't praise, et cetera. And it's just a delicate dynamic. And Bob, I loved what you just said there is, this is the value of the leader doing his own work, because you can not even be aware that you're doing it, but you're bringing that stuff to the table and bringing that stuff to leadership. Brett, a thing that you and I've referenced regularly on Way of the Heart podcast is the phrase from Dallas Willard that says, the Father is scouring the world looking for people with whom he can entrust his power. And often he ends up finding people with whom they will hurt themselves and everyone else around them if he actually gave them what they asked for. It's like, oh my gosh. And so there's the Father's dying to give us his authority and power, but at times can't because of how we'll use it for our own validation or whatever.
So true. I don't know why this is coming to mind, but I know you guys have quoted The Chosen before. We all love the Chosen series, but the call of Matthew, remember that exchange where Jesus just stops and he looks, we know his life's never going to be the same. And he's observing Matthew and you can just see the tenderness in his eyes. And nobody knows what he's up to, not initially. And then he calls Matthew and Peter right away is like, no, this can't be. Do you know who that guy is? Do you know what he's done? And Jesus is like, yeah. And he's like, how about you, Peter? Yeah, but that's different. And then get used to different, that great line, right?
Yeah.
But it's just like, that is an icon of what we're talking about, I think. It's not like we're blind to things, mistakes, failures, whatever, but there's no shaming in our presence. One of my favorite lines of leadership, and I think this is just so important at home, in ministry, or whatever, is to understand people are going to forget what you say, what you do, your strategies, how you handle meetings, all of that. They will never forget how they felt in your presence. They will never forget it. You know, are you a maximizer or are you a minimizer? Do you bring shame or do you bring hope and a future, right? And it's got to come from a healed heart where you can look beyond what everybody sees in an individual. I mean, is that not what our seeking Savior was all about? Is that not who he was with Mary Magdalene, with Peter, with the Apostle Paul, with us, with you, me, with everybody? It's seeing what they can be and communicating that to them until they actually believe it in themselves. And then they can walk out of it, you know, live their life out of it. But that idea of how people feel in your presence is just so key.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
And sobering.
Oh, yes, it is.
What do you mean there, Bob?
Just thinking in my own life, the places of unhealed places, past and present, of ways in which do I maximize myself or do I minimize myself, right? Am I always creating a standard of performance for myself? Or do I feel like I'm being enlarged as I relate to myself? And then as I do it to myself, I'm going to do it to the people around me without even being conscious. So it's again, back to the heart, you know, back to, you know, we can be conscious of these things and we need to be conscious of these things, but we also need to be conscious of them in our own journey and where we've internalized that shame. Because, you know, it's so deep. Shame is so deep and it's really hard, even if our heart is for somebody in that way, for them not to take a correction as shame just because of their own woundedness, right? And for us to do the same thing within ourselves.
Yeah. It's just layers of
layers.
Healing.
Yep.
Just continual, right?
Yeah.
Jake, you've heard me tell this story many times, but there was an incident when one of my boys was young. We got 5 boys, so that means a lot of chaos in the house.
Yeah.
So we had this driveway and we did some renovations, and right at the end of the driveway, we put 2 bedrooms and with bedroom windows and that kind of thing. And I created these plastic crates that would, you know, the boys would put them on to protect the windows before they go out and play hockey. And sure enough, one day they forgot to put the plastic plates on. Boom, off it goes. And, you know, the son that was guilty of this infraction comes to me. And this is just such an icon for me to learn from, because he had enough courage in him to bring it to me. But he was scared. He was literally trembling. And for whatever reason, in the moment that day, God gave grace to just bend down and forgive and hug. And it doesn't matter. I know it was a mistake and all that. But I tell you, for every time I do that, there's many opportunities where I haven't. And either I'm operating from a place of healing myself because I can extend grace when you've received it, or you're operating from a place of performance orientation and anxiety and just all the other stuff, and people feel it. This is there's still a work in progress.
Yeah, it is. I think as you're telling that scene with your son, I think of that scene in the Cinderella Man. Have you seen that, where the father is? I would weep. We do it at our men's conference. You probably did too. And I just weep every time I saw that. It's just the father getting down on the level of his son. He's correcting him. He's having him bring it back. He's facing all that. And then he goes from being above the son in his authority. You know, we don't ever steal.
Yeah.
And then the son starts to bring out his fear of, I'm going to be sent off. This is in the middle of depression. I'm going to be sent off like my buddy. And he gets down eye to eye, says, I am never going to leave you. We're never going to send you off. And then the son just burst into tears. I mean, to me, what you described in that scene with your son I felt that in that scene in the movie. It's so powerful.
It's the security.
Yeah, it's the security.
And that's what we've experienced. I will never leave you or forsake you.
Yeah.
No matter what you do.
Yeah.
And when leaders don't know that, like this is the thing I'm thinking about right now is fear, the power of fear in leadership, and the utter need for fear to be healed. Because I think for all of us, when we describe performance orientation, we've done enough of peeling the onion to know that at the core of that, there's a fear of, and fill in the blank. Like for me, fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of being found inadequate, and then being abandoned or rejected, you know? And so that fear being something that's so powerful, and it actually is fueling a lot of the decisions that we make. And then we're trying to avoid shame. And you guys, we both know this, like, where do we find ourselves when we start talking about fear and shame? We're right back at the garden.
Yeah.
Like we are front and center. Sin number one in the whole darn scheme of things is I was afraid because I was naked. And so I hid, right? Like I don't like the exposure of not having it all together. So I'm hiding stuff and faking it and and to me, that is a diagnosis in a way for so much leadership right now, and what is in need of healing. And so, Brett, this is what I love about you and the leadership's, formation and stuff that you bring, is that you're not just coming forward with a technique of how to do a good type of meeting or just a technique of, when you correct an employee, blah, blah, blah. I know that you go, what's going on in the dynamics of your heart? Because if you don't go there, the technique, it's somewhat meaningless, and it can come across as a major facade. Right? It can be really off-putting to people when they know you're faking it because you're really trying to perform to get the praise of the guy above you,
Yeah.
All those layers. Like, what I'm curious, Brett, for you, like, how did that happen, and the integration that you've made? Because I've seen it firsthand in projects and work that we've done together. I see it regularly in the podcast with you and I. But you're integrating very clear concepts of leadership and the heart, and even your tagline, leadership where it matters most. Right? And so can you just talk about that integration?
Yeah, because you could call it, to use language in the literature, it would be smart and healthy, right? Smart is all those aspects of leadership that are kind of personality, ethic. They're the strategy, they're disproportionate investment of resources, they're operational plans, they're all these things, all this jargon, and they all matter. They're all extremely important, right? But if relationships aren't right, nothing is right. Jake, you know how many times we talked about if things aren't right at home, nothing's right. Like nothing's right. It's just the way life is. So if things aren't right relationally, if we're not in right relationship with people, all those other things are just smoke and mirrors, and they will come across as disingenuous or superficial or, whatever. But when the relationship is there, when the leader is healthy enough to create environments of safety and flourishing and healthy joking and, humility and just all the things that are so necessary for a healthy culture, then all those other things matter. But you can never put the cart before the horse in leadership. You have to be healthy first. It has to be relationships first. And that's what, all of this thing of healing and bringing our whole healed hearts to bear matter. And you can't fake it. There's no such thing as faking it. You can fake some strategic planning and you can use jargon and all this kind of stuff, and many guys are tempted to, but you can't fake sincerity. You can't fake authentic love and care and concern for people, right? So both are needed, but one is fundamental. It's like I was told, I don't know who, maybe it was Vernon Robertson, who, Jake, but it's kind of like, I don't know why this analogy is coming to mind, but it's coming to mind. All of us are juggling a bunch of balls in the air, right? But only one of them is made of glass. And that's your relationship with your wife and your kids. In other words, there are some things that are infinitely more important than other things, and they should never be at the mercy of something that you deem more important. Your character, your substance, your presence as a leader. It is infinitely important than anything you bring to bear in terms of the smart stuff with strategy and resources and organizational structure and all those things. They're all necessary, but they're secondary.
Yeah, a lot of wisdom in that. Can you share how, as you are consulting or leading and leading people into leadership, how do you implement this? How do you bring them into that awareness? How do you teach it? How do you form it? Not just as a leader, but as a consultant to leaders.
Right. Bring about the priority of those other things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I guess it has to take, like nothing is a priority unless your resources are put toward it. So if you're spending your time, your money, your energy on those things, then that's the priority, right? So the questions are, how are you, caring for your staff? And giving pause on those relational aspects. Like, it's so easy in the consulting world to stay in the superficial because you sound smart and all of that. And yet, if you really want to help an organization flourish, it has to be relationships. And it has to be trust. Trust is the one thing that changes everything in every relationship. And if trust isn't there, you have no foundation on which to build. Trust is the foundation on the organization. The organization cannot outgrow the foundation of trust on which it's built. And if there's not a culture of trust, nothing else can be formed. So it's a matter of just continually prioritizing it. And this is hard for a lot of leaders because it's what people would consider the soft skills, if you will. There's nothing soft about them. It's going to impact your bottom line, your, resources against mission, however you want to metric it. It's going to impact it more than anything else, is a culture of trust and real legitimate care and concern for people. Right.
Brett, I've seen you do it in ways where you will ask the difficult question that nobody else wants to ask in that meeting or in that setting that's about these kinds of things instead of the smart skills or whatever you call it. So I've seen you do it where you'll open up the thing that either some people see is there but don't want to go there, or some people don't even see that's there. And then they realize, oh my, right? You can have very genuine leaders, and sometimes that's our bishops and priests who are very good-hearted, and it's possible that they don't even see that the relational dynamic is what's gone awry, and they're just kind of moving things forward. I think that's probably a very difficult thing for bishops. I know, Bob, when we were talking to Archbishop Sample, he was indirectly referencing that whole dynamic with his priests, where trust and relationship were not primary. And if he kept driving it forward, all he was doing was making his diocese more ill, at a time where illness was not convenient, right? You need a lot of health right now, emotionally and spiritually, psychologically.
And his courage to be willing to face that. And that's the hard place, right? Is you go in and you bring that out in the open, and it's really a choice of the leader whether they're going to go there.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. This is one of those examples. So there's a lot of books that would have the title, lead with questions. So it's like, oh, I'm going to ask a bunch of questions. It's like, that's not what that means. It's what we're saying is lead with curiosity. Yeah. Like, be authentically curious. That's where your question should come from. Somebody once told me, never ask a question in a meeting unless you know the answer. And I was like,
weird.
That doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
That's a very safe thing to do. I think you ask questions because you don't know the answer. That's what curiosity is, right?
Right.
But here's the thing, not just on matters of strategy. So you're in a meeting and something is said about something, and a guy just kind of does a glance down. It's like his heart matters more than anything else that we're talking about right now. Say his name. I noticed a little bit of a downward look. Is there something going on that we can understand where you're at or help with? Like, just stop and ask a question. And I have seen so many times that leads to beautiful unfolding of whether they're sharing from their heart or whatever it is, but a real bonding of the people in the room. Because Jake, you and I have said this, but that which is most personal is usually universal. And when you give each other the freedom to actually explore those things together, that's real relationship happens. But sometimes it's harder things, and sometimes it is around whether it's strategy or, whatever. But asking the hard question, I think it's one of the benefits, Jake, I've joked about this with you in the past, but I am never, I'm in a place now in my leadership where I never have the privilege of being the smartest person in the room. Never. There are experts all the time. And so I get to ask these dumb, questions that clearly demonstrate to everybody in the room, I don't know the first thing about what we're talking about, but just ask it, right? Like, it leads to actual relationship. It leads to information that's necessary. So anyways.
That's really good. Yeah. I want to start to land the plane here in our conversation. And so, Brett, I'm curious, this is a virtually impossible question, but we'll just see what the Spirit moves in you. But, if you have kind of thoughts and parting words, what are some final things that you would just say to upcoming leaders? And again, I'm trying to, if somebody came midway through our episode, I just want to highlight again, leadership's not just you're the guy at work and you have employees that work for you. We're using a much more robust and I think more accurate definition here. So upcoming leaders who are struggling, just kind of any final thoughts or words that you'd like to just put out there for our listeners?
Sure. I mean, when you said upcoming leaders, one of the things that comes to mind is to recognize that leadership is not about privilege. That leadership really is about sacrifice. And that, when I start getting more and more responsibility, if you want to say, and all the rest of it, the thing that became very clear to me is that there was no additional privilege. There was actually less privilege, a lot more responsibility, and more feet to wash. And you can't be in that space where you're constantly being tapped for more from you, of you, etc., unless your heart is in a process of being healed and strengthened. Because the weight of the responsibility can crush you. If you're feeling crushed, you can try and grasp others to make up for it, and you're not going to be in a good place, and it could really take you out. And I don't say that to shame anybody, but just to recognize that the best thing you can do for your leadership is to encounter the Father and to bring the areas of wound and pain to Him, to be healed through whether it's conferences or through books, through incredible counseling, fellowship with people, opening your heart. I would be a mess if I didn't have my wife in my life. She is the safest place in the world for me. Mm-hmm. And I desperately need our encounters together to bring deeper healing because more is asked. So the healing this is not a nice thing. This is a necessary thing. And I just invite everybody to take it, I guess seriously might be a strong word, but it really matters. And the Lord wants to heal. And He wants to bring about a depth of experience of His love and mercy, forgiveness, security, proximity in your life that is transforming. And it's necessary. It's the foundation of leadership.
A lot of wisdom. Thank you, Brett. I really take it in myself, and I hope everybody's listening can take that in and begin to apply it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I want to share a story. Maybe this will make it, maybe it won't, but I'll bless Dr. Bob.
Okay.
Because I don't think you know this, Dr. Bob, but when we saw you in Tacoma,
yeah.
Unbeknownst to you, we were in the midst of a really difficult situation because we had a home that we owned 4,000 kilometers from where we were living. And we had people that were tenants it was just not a good situation. They hadn't paid rent for 10 months. They're trashing the place. It was horrible. I won't get into more details. We almost didn't come on the retreat because we were so taken out by this. It was late enough in the year that I think it was another 6 weeks and we wouldn't be able to evict because you can't do it over the winter, understandably. Anyways, so we're going on this retreat and we're just desperate, Dr. Bob. We're absolutely desperate. Like, we don't got financial margin in our lives to carry 2 homes with no income coming in. And you took us through a meditation, and we looked at an image of the Samaritan. And it was right when the Samaritan was coming, the Good Samaritan was coming to the person that was wounded. And I remember praying, this is in your retreat, and literally saying, Lord, we are bleeding out. And if you don't act, like, I don't know where this is going. So come out of that prayer time, I share it with my wife, and she looks at me and I look at her, and we just said, he's got this. That was an act of faith. Go to check my text messages. Our landlord said, she's found a house. She's out.
Wow.
And it happened right there.
Wow.
Now, sometimes the healing takes a lot of work. Sometimes the Father just bursts in and says, I've got you, son.
Yeah.
And I need it all. I need it all. I don't know about you guys, but I need it all. But that was, it was certainly in the environment that you created. It moved to faith, just a cry of desperation, Lord, please. And there was nothing we could do. There's nothing we could do. And he acted. So thank you.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
Amen.
That's so good. Guys, this has been really fun. And blending of my worlds, but I'm so glad to have spent this time with you. Bob, we're going to have you over on the other podcast to share the goodness and wealth, just to dive into the hearts of men. So again, where can you find out more about Brett? He's on Instagram, Twitter. We'll put all that in the show notes. brettpowell.org, leadership where it matters most. And this podcast called Way of the Heart podcast, where a familiar voice, mine, is over there as well. So that podcast is mainly for men, but a lot of women listen as well to get an insight into the heart of men. So guys, this has been awesome. Thank you so much again, Brett. We really appreciate you, and I'm very grateful for you and glad that you could join us today. So listeners, we are hoping that this was a great blessing to you. I know it was for me and Bob. And so we look forward to chatting with you again soon. God bless you.